what your country can do.
Kennedy has been shot.
One small step for man.
To be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
By the spring of 1953, nearly 50,000 Americans had returned home from the Korean War in coffins. People at home continued to wonder how much longer they would have to endure this strange war being fought in a strange land.
I had two brothers who were serving in Korea at the same time, and I was scared to death because I wanted my brothers to come home. And when they came home, it was like, thank you, Lord. Greatest day in the world.
In that summer of 1953, the U.S. finally reached a truce agreement with the North Koreans and the Chinese. And Americans tried to put another war behind them. President Eisenhower had kept his campaign pledge to resolve the Korean conflict. Now he hoped to make America's domestic life his priority.
I believe in the future of the United States of America.
He was going to really take care of the United States. He was going to take care of us personally. And it was a good feeling.
The time was right for Dwight Eisenhower.
One of the things that Ike most wanted to do when he became president was to lower the rhetoric and lower the sense of crisis.
His countrymen were more than ready to relax. With the war over and America bursting with energy, it was time to focus on a more promising future. By 1953, the American people had been dealing with one crisis or another since 1929. The Great Depression, World War II, the Berlin blockade, and then Korea. Eisenhower felt it was now time to turn back the clock to the America of his childhood, a simpler country, where it turned out white males had the last word and where women kept the home fires burning, and the business of America was business. At first, many Americans seemed happy to oblige. But as the decade wore on, Eisenhower and they would discover that not everyone was ready to return to the old way of doing things. By late 1953, the economic boom that had arrived after the Second World War had already transformed the country.
We were a self-confident people for the first time since 1929. People putting money in the banks. The real wages were going up 4.5% a year. It's just incredible to think about that now.
America in the 1950s was very rapidly becoming a consumer society. People were buying more and selling more than ever before in history. For the first time, more Americans were doing white-collar work than manual labor. Advertising, marketing, and public relations were now the preferred professions.
Well, I can certainly do with 8 or 10,000, but I don't know anything about public relations.
Who does? You got a clean shirt, you bathe every day, and that's all there's to it.
In the shadow of the Cold War, it seemed almost patriotic to be part of the American economic miracle, to be a member of a corporate team and follow its rules.
When I became a salesman, like a man with a gray flannel suit, I was told where to buy my clothes. It might not have been a gray flannel suit, but it better be a blue one. And there was a lot of choices of colored shirts as long as they were white. You called attention to yourself if you deviated from the norm, and nobody did. Nobody did. We all looked the same.
I think people kind of like to be dressed alike and follow the same sort of social customs. You were expected to have at least 2 drinks at lunch, preferably martinis. If anyone said, "I'll have a Perrier," they would have been laughed at.
And when they advertised for secretaries, they specified good-looking. It was not a good time for women in the workplace.
Miss Lawrence, this is Mr. Rath. Miss Lawrence will be your secretary.
How do you do, Miss Lawrence?
Very glad to meet you, Mr. Rath.
They always give a new man the prettiest secretary.
There were no female managers. None. It wasn't even considered.
In the 1950s, the woman's place was in the home, in the embrace of a loving husband. By 1957, 97% of all marriageable men and women were married. And if they cared to have a social life, they stayed that way.
It was a couples society. We did things in couples, barbecues, and it's always couples. If we knew that the person was divorced, we might have a second thought about asking them. The thing was to be married and keep the home together.
More and more, that home was on America's new crabgrass frontier. In an era that favored conformity, it was perhaps no surprise that by the end of the decade, a quarter of the population lived in the tract homes of the modern suburb.
Moving in for us was the beginning of a happy experience, of a challenging experience. Everything was similar. One of my friends was Ruby. My phone rings and he says to me, "Hal, I have a problem." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I can't find my house."
It seemed kind of remote and bleak if you look at them from the air. But in those little cookie-cutter houses on those straight streets that met at right angles, a lot of good things were happening.
Children were being born at a very fast rate. There were 3 obstetricians, and the obstetricians were open till 2 a.m. in the morning. This was the place to raise children because it offered everything that they could want.
I was here at my own home, across the street at the neighbor's home, down the block at a friend's home, without any restriction, without any feeling that I was violating anyone's territory. The emotional core of the early 1950s was all about stability. Both my parents had experienced the Depression. Both my parents had experienced the war. I know that they looked upon their little house in Lakewood as a refuge from many of the things that had troubled their early lives.
The activities were centered around the home. We had a lot of parties.
People were of the same age. Our interests were alike. We came together that way. We seemed all to be interested in what we were doing for the good of all of us.
It was a fabulous life.
And life was getting better for a lot of American families. Propelled by the powerful economy, they were stepping into the middle class at a rate of more than $1 million a year. With extra money to spend and plenty of shiny new merchandise to choose from, people bought things whether they needed them or not, sometimes just to match the pace of their neighbors.
We had an eye on consumer goods all the time. Keeping up with the Joneses. When people would give us a call on the phone that the television set was just delivered, it wouldn't be long before we'd be down having soda, watching the new television. And as soon as we left there, we would say, that's what we have to have next.
A new television would soon become the thing that everyone had to have next. It was in the early 1950s that one of America's most intense love affairs blossomed most brightly.
We plug this thing in and turn on this box, and there are people there. Well, I want to tell you, we did not move for days.
You sat in front of that set even when there was nothing on but the test pattern. You thought, you can't tell, they're liable to put on something right now.
Television sets were rapidly becoming affordable for the average consumer, and as they did, the demand for new programming became overwhelming.
That's right, boys and girls.
Most television programs aired live with all the flaws of a live performance, yet even with mistakes, most viewers loved the tube.
The television business was a sandbox where you could go in with almost any idea and you have a chance to do it. It was an amazing period of time.
Radio, long the staple of family entertainment, was virtually abandoned. Nimble talents like Milton Berle and the famous newscaster Edward R. Murrow made the transition to the new medium.
It brought us news. It brought us dramas. It had become an integral part of our life. And it wouldn't be unusual for your doctor to say, I'll see you at 7 o'clock on Tuesday, and you would say, I am very sorry. I Love Lucy is on. I have to see I Love Lucy.
By the mid-1950s, only a few years after their commercial introduction, television sets were in 3/4 of American homes. People now spent 1/3 of their waking hours in the glow of the box. Lured by entertainment, they became a captive audience for the salesman.
These 3 windows, ABC, CBS, and NBC, were a window on a world that a family could sit down and look out of and see what they didn't have.
Ah, I know what you're going to show us. A Westinghouse refrigerator.
A Westinghouse refrigerator freezer.
Everything that you did was geared at a family